Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are now over halfway through our look at gliders and troop carriers, and rather a bit of focus on the British side of things yesterday and the day before, although some mentioned the US today. It's about the Americans. Today's guest is Scott McGaugh, who is formerly heavily involved in the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, which I visited last month. We may talk about that in a moment, but he has now turned his attention to American glider pilots and is the author of this book I'm holding up now, Brotherhood of the Flying Coffin. Links to purchasing the books are in the description below, or you can find it at your local bookstore or library or wherever you buy your books. So I'm going to bring Scott in now. It's morning still for you, isn't it there?
Yes, it is. It's morning, and more notably in San Diego, it's actually raining this morning.
Raining, so yeah. Well,
we're on suicide watch.
So, as I said there in the introduction, I was on the USS Midway recently, and it's a trite comment to make. An aircraft carrier is enormous. My first time on an aircraft carrier. Yeah. How did you make the transition from the hugest thing in the American military war machine to pretty much one of the smallest bits of kit, the glider? Where did that transition come about from?
Well, there were a lot of steps in between. What really started, Paul, was getting involved with Midway. And realizing no one had written a book about the unprecedented 47-year odyssey of service aboard Midway and those 100,000 young men whose average age was only 19. So I wrote that book, and it's led now to 10 other books, mostly focusing on the greatest generation, unsung heroes. And one thing led to another. My most recent book about a Japanese-American rescue unit in World War II. There was a brief mention of some of the soldiers not being available. They were in southern France by glider.
Right.
Glider, I thought. I wrote down the word glider, finished the book, started then looking into the whole notion of gliders in World War II. And the Brotherhood resulted about 2 years later. So it's been one book leading to the next about the greatest generation.
Brilliant stuff. And one of the things I think we'll delve into is, it seems, we talked about this with Mike yesterday, is that in a lot of the general histories about World War II, the people who write about the gliders, the people who flew them, the people who rode in them, aren't necessarily fans of technology. They're kind of dismissive of them, and they're a little bit, and they brush off some of the things there. And it seems it needs people who are passionate about. We had Kevin on 2 days ago talking about the Horsa glider. You could not find an individual more passionate about a particular type of aircraft. So, the glider pilots, they have had some short shrift over the years. Some historians, no names mentioned, Stephen Ambrose, are very critical of their performance and said they were the worst quality pilots, this, that, and the other. Right. It's time to kind of redress the balance and talk about them. So you've come on with a PowerPoint, which I'll bring up, and then you can control it, folks. We'll do questions as we go along, but Scott's going to take us through kind of the history of the various operations, but please feel free to dive in with questions. But we're thinking we're going to focus particularly on the men, right, and the people behind it rather than the tech. But if you want to go techie, we'll do our best to answer your questions. But essentially, over to you, Scott.
Well, thank you, Paul. And indeed, I'm a historian about people, heroes on the battlefield that I would like to have over for dinner. That's as much what I'm about than worrying about squadron numbers and troop carrier numbers and so on, not to dismiss that. Other historians do that very, very well. Instead, I think more about the people, including someone like this, General Henry Hap Arnold. The story of gliders really starts with this man in 1938 when he took command of the Air Corps. War was on the horizon, as we all know. We had a very depleted and decrepit and antiquated Air Force at that time. And he was an unusual man in which glider pilots someday would put their lives in his hands. He was the second choice of West Point. He was the second choice of his father going to West Point. And apparently with good reason, he finished in the middle of his class, 66th out of 111. When he entered the Air Corps with biplanes, he developed a fear of flying. And yet by 1938, he was commander of the Air Forces for the buildup. In 1941, about 6 months before Pearl Harbor, he ordered the design of investigation of the concept of gliders. And by 1942, he was issuing orders for 5,000 trained pilots and about 5,000 gliders. Meanwhile, glider pilots were still in high school and college and raising families and that sort of thing, getting ready to volunteer for an aircraft that not yet had been invented at the start of World War II. Remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah.
And this is what resulted. As you said, we're not going to get into a whole lot of technical details. It's been touched on by some of your other guests, and very ably so. But when you take a look at that, I was just flabbergasted to realize that this was an aircraft that was basically comprised of steel tubing and reinforced fabric. It was a flying tent, a flying box kite, some people called it, 48 feet long, a wingspan of around 84 feet. What was remarkable to me is it's comprised of 70,000 parts.
Wow.
I'm still not sure where they come from or where they are.
Someone will know, Scott. Someone will say.
Yes.
There'll be a list somewhere.
Yeah, indeed. The control panel up front, 5 dials. That was it. Cable controlled, a wood floor, a honeycomb plywood floor of 5,000 pieces for the payload, more than anything else. But it was it had zippers in it, Paul, literally for assembly as well as for maintenance. Who would volunteer to fly a plane or an aircraft with zippers? And yet people did, and be released from 500 feet in enemy territory on one-way missions. But this is what they flew.
Just a quick question for you, Scott, because it's come up earlier in that, the British program did start earlier because it just did. And they're looking at what the Germans are doing. And there's been, moments the Germans use gliders incredibly effectively, and also moments where they didn't work effectively. Is the US kind of looking at both of these aspects? Are they torn? Are some people saying we definitely don't want to go down this route, and other people like Arnold saying we definitely should go down this route? Is there division of opinion about the possibility of how gliders can be used?
I did not see that, Paul, in my research. I didn't go real deeply into that at that point. I was anxious to get into the war, if you will, and the glider pilots. But in reading Arnold's biography and a number of others, I don't know that it was an afterthought, but in the overall scale of the run up to the war and the bomber building program and the fighter building program and so on, it was a small slice of the run up to engagement in the ETO. So I don't know that it really garnered that much attention in the big scale of things, which we'll get into here in just a minute. Yeah. So, but just real quickly here, that plane, the C-47 Skytrain towing that glider, a lot of people don't realize that nylon rope was less than an inch in diameter. Carrying a 3 to 4 ton aircraft, for hundreds of miles. It's just a remarkable concept that young pilots would very soon put their faith in this man and what was being designed. And here's just a few examples. I had such great fortune to have access to little recognized archives of their diaries, letters home, interviews later in life that many, many people have not seen before. And I was really struck by their dedication and faith that they would, again, volunteer for an aircraft not yet invented and missions not yet fully contemplated. It wasn't even invented, much less being built yet. And yet these were all volunteers. Ultimately, about 4,000 of them saw combat in Europe. A relatively, again, small slice, but a significant contribution, Ambrose notwithstanding, and so on. But many times I had these photos and many others up on my computer screens just as a reminder that this is how history is made. History was made on the backs of these young men with families at home and fathers and mothers wondering if they would have a knock on the door by a chaplain or whatever. And so I think that's important to remember that this is about people more so than just the aircraft, if you will, from that perspective.
Yeah, and we're getting lots of questions, Scott, about did they volunteer? Do they know the risk? Where do they come from? So that's exactly what we want you to cover, because again, we're battling some of these preconceptions about them being washouts, and and feel free to rant as much as you want about the previous writings about this group of men, because we're left with the legacy of some of what these other historians have said, and it's now is the occasion to remind ourselves that these people aren't or weren't what some people said they were.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there were so few in number. And their legacy, began with a disaster in Sicily, which we'll get to in just a couple of minutes. Some of them were washouts from flight school. Others were just, some were already in the Army and unhappy with their assignment. And when this whole concept of glider pilots opened up, in the beginning, the requirements were too high, too strict. A lot of people were not qualified. They had a shortage of gliders, pilot candidates. They had to lower the application requirements and so on. So it was a very haphazard, if you will, literally test pilot, which will come up again and again as a theme, program. How do you train for a glider not yet available? So they had to use sailplanes. And when you think about it for a moment, sailplanes, it's all about staying up as long as you can. Gliders were just the opposite. No training facilities existed. So these young men volunteering from around the country were sent to Arkansas and Arizona and Texas, Oklahoma. You can see from the photo the sophistication, if you will, of some of those training camps, programs and bases. But that's what it took in the race to get into the war. Basically in 1942 is when the training really got going, while the glider was still being invented. And it was deadly. It was, as you can see here, it was something that ultimately a lot of people are surprised that there were more fatalities, deaths in World War II in training than in combat when it came to the glider pilots. Some of the reports from other folks in terms of losing buddies, what it sounds like when a glider crashes into the trees at night, are just heartbreaking. The photo in the upper right was a training accident between missions in Europe. It's one of the more poignant passages in the book. And I think it's something that we all need to remember, that these men were sacrificing not just in combat, but back home as well, from a training standpoint. They were in harm's way all the time, for many different reasons. It was really chaotic in ways that I think are heartbreaking. And yet, again, they were volunteers and they were there to serve their country. The one on the photo on the right, techniques of landing a glider was really more, I don't want to say literally crash landing, but we'll call them hard landings in pilot terms, going up on the nose, or there were reports of these sometimes catching a wing and cartwheeling down a landing zone like a cheerleader at a football game. That really, I think, brings it home to what these men were experiencing and sacrificing in the various missions. And
sorry to interrupt you, Scott. Leslie is just, we talked a lot Mike talked a lot yesterday about the concept of the British glider pilot regiment always being seen as soldiers and pilots, and the two early commanders, one saw them as pilots first, soldiers second, the other one saw them as soldiers first, pilots second. The American concept was not that they're never to be soldiers. They are pilots. That's their primary thing. But the Americans, were they rigid about that? Did they ever consider any other options? It was always going to be pilots.
Pilots first and foremost. They did receive some combat training, and it varied at different times in terms of the length and the amount. It's my impression that it increased as the war went along to some extent because of the realities on the battlefield. This was a program that was being invented from one mission to the next. It had never happened before. This whole idea of vertical envelopment, attacking the enemy from the front and the rear, and the role of glider pilots resupplying and remanning the paratroopers within a few hours of the paratroopers landing. So there were lessons being learned, starting with Sicily, of course, along those lines. And ultimately, and I'll touch on it here in a little bit, there was a provisional infantry unit established of glider pilots for one of the missions, because again, we were learning from mission to mission what it took for glider pilots, one, to land, to get to the battlefield, to land on the battlefield, to unload their gliders, report to an assembly point. And it wasn't a matter of catching a bus back to the base by any stretch of the imagination. Sometimes it took them a week or two or even longer to get back to England, or France, later on in the wars. So combat training was an element. It was clearly secondary compared to the British. a different concept. And in fact, it really caused some resentment on the battlefield. General Gavin, after Market Garden, was very vociferous in written reports about the glider pilots, no one being more dedicated to serving on the battlefield once they landed, but being no one was more unequipped to do so effectively. So if anything, I think the ground commanders wished that the glider pilots had more training, so they could be more useful once they fulfilled their primary mission. But as you indicated at the outset, it was always secondary from the Air Corps' perspective, and getting those guys back to base for the next mission, which sometimes was only a few weeks away.
Thank you.
Sicily, of course, we've talked about that in some of your previous episodes and so on. It was a disaster from the get-go. Colonel Vallejos described that very well in terms of a misplaned or poorly planned operation from the very beginning. The idea of flying across the Mediterranean, as it turned out, in a storm at night by being towed by inexperienced American tow crews in gliders that the British pilots had not trained much in, no major rehearsal beforehand, short of time, short of everything, basically, in terms of cooperation, coordination, communication, that led to the disaster that took place in Operation Husky. In reading the pilots' accounts, I think this was the one operation that anger permeated everything they said or wrote, and perhaps felt more so than any other mission in World War II. The relative small handful, only a few dozen volunteers to fly as co-pilots, at least initially in this mission, came home just livid. And exactly the things that you've been talking about in former episodes and what we're touching on right now. And in some cases, literally, the American pilots were the pilots in the gliders. They reported to their glider on the day of the mission, and the British glider pilot said, "You've got more experience than I do. You want to take command?" And the Americans did, which probably pretty good made sense in terms of level of experience and training and so on. But regardless, to see the 600 men were lost, half by drowning. Only 2, I think, of the American pilots made it ashore, anywhere close to their landing zone. It was truly tragic by every measure, and the anger that came from this was so palpable that General Eisenhower was really seriously reconsidering the value of airborne, not just gliders, but airborne, much less anything beyond the size of a battalion.
And that's really interesting, Scott, that whole concept, because following any operation, whether it's large or small, that goes wrong, there's some kind of collective fallout, whether people focus on the pride of what they nearly achieved, or in this case, anger. And it's, because obviously when we get to July, I'm going to do a whole series of shows about Husky. There'll be, again, we'll examine the airborne plan, what went wrong, those kind of high level aspects of it. But the human reaction to it is what really interests me, and what interested me about your book, because the idea of a collective feeling among the units is really fascinating, and anger is in some ways can be a positive. Not a positive, but it focuses you on what's coming ahead. The anger can drive you forwards, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, to get born of battlefield realities. This was, in many ways, certainly from the airborne standpoint, a baptism by fire, literally, tragically. In fact, gliders being covered in reinforced fabric proved to be very flammable. And when you're carrying 300 or 400 gallons of fuel in the back, or ordnance, or high explosives, you can be successful in getting to your landing zone, and then disaster can strike, obviously. And that certainly was the case from a fatality standpoint, from a casualty standpoint, from a tactical standpoint. Not only were the losses horrendous, those who made it through and anywhere near the landing zones and the bridge and so on were so far off target, including the airborne, that there was a real question as to the potential value of this strategy and tactics in the coming invasion of Europe, the continent. But obviously things continued.
Yeah, and as you've you literally got a photo on screen there of smoke billowing out of a glider carcass there, but like a part of phoenix from the ashes, the airborne program does continue. It prospers. I know we're going to talk about Normandy and Market Garden and Varsity later on, but as you said, that you reminded us there was a consideration of abandoning the whole concept of airborne. Yeah. Airborne is high risk. Every time we do a show about this, we remind ourselves that for every successful airborne operation in World War II, there are disasters, and when they go wrong, they tend to go really badly wrong.
Yes.
So out of this is this continuation. So the people who see the value of this as a concept, the pilots who've lost a friend over Husky, they're the ones who, out of them, they forge the methods of persevering and improving things. So anything else you want to kind of say about the pilot reaction to Husky and things they took forward on kind of an individual basis or on a sort of tactical basis? Anything else you want to say about that?
None at this point. Several of them wrote very critical letters to their commanding officers, their own after action reports, if you will, beyond the standard things that you saw and that I've certainly researched and read. They were so angry at the whole concept, at least the way Sicily Husky came together. You can see the numbers here. It's no surprise that they were appalled at the losses and what they saw as needless losses. But I think, again, in the bigger concept, remember, these guys were test pilots. Everyone was learning on the fly, literally. Not to excuse anything, but nonetheless, it was a reality at that point. And when you think about, Husky, fortunately, there were about 10 months between Husky and Normandy. So there was time to revamp, improve training, improve the quality of the gliders. That was a constant challenge. We didn't even touch on the manufacturing of the gliders early on in the war and their horrific quality. But by this point, we're talking about, the ETO and one mission after another. Certainly Normandy. These are glider pilots and airborne folks getting briefed. If the photo's large enough and you really look at their faces, I just can't imagine what's going through their thoughts. The British pilots didn't want to fly the CG-4As, thinking they were cursed from Sicily's experience. Some of the American pilots weren't real comfortable with the Horsa glider, in completely different flight characteristics. Who was I forgot? Oh, Air Marshal Lee Mallory wrote Eisenhower talking about maybe 75% casualty rates for the gliders and 50% for the paratroopers. I doubt those numbers were part of the briefing. I hope they weren't for these volunteers. But this is another one of those photos I've looked at many, many times and tried to imagine what was going through these men's minds, knowing that, 2 days, 1,000 gliders, 2 days and waves of gliders over Utah, 6 miles inland, based on the only knowledge they had was the Sicily experience, just had to be shocking to them. And yet they did it, as we well know. And they were very successful in reinforcing and rearming the paratroopers. And bad intelligence is probably not the greatest phrase to use. Faulty intelligence, learning what kind of intelligence the airborne truly needed, taking photos not at midday so you can see the shadows of the hedgerows to get a sense of the vegetation. Those weren't hedges, which is what the Americans thought. I would have thought. The actual size of the landing zones, many of them were smaller than the length of a flight deck of USS Midway. Of course, the notion of flooding and that kind of thing. One of the things, Paul, that I really found fascinating in listening and reading their accounts was how inventive they were and how intuitive they were. One pilot said, "We learned very quickly to look for cows." And I couldn't imagine why they'd be looking for cows. Well, the thinking was that if there were cattle grazing in a pasture or a field, the Germans probably had not minded, that the farmers knew it was safe, and that they could use those fields for livestock and that sort of thing. And partly as a result, then you saw gliders landing on top of each other and colliding as they all scrambled for what they thought was a safer field than the one next door from a landing zone standpoint. Landings were so hard, so brutal that 97% of the gliders were not usable. That would be something that would hold true for the rest of the war. And yet glider pilot casualties and glider infantry casualties weren't horrific. I think really a testament to the sturdiness of this aircraft, even with hard landings and what we would consider as civilians crash landings. It was still a very successful program in many, many ways. I think beyond what a lot of the senior officers envisioned. When you look at the numbers, just the sheer numbers that 1,000 gliders roughly, brought to the battlefield, it's impressive. I would think paratroopers who are there waiting for this equipment and manpower to arrive would be forever grateful that these glider pilots were able to deliver these kinds of numbers on one-way missions with obviously no motors, no parachutes, and certainly no second chances. They were truly defenseless. And yet I'm always impressed when I see these kinds of numbers. It really gives me a sense of just how their role was, I think, far greater than what, as we talked about earlier, most people know, much less recognize.
And definitely, Scott, and I, to compare the British and Americans, I mean, we talked about with Mike and with Kevin. For the British, we have the highlight, of course, is getting those gliders, the Pegasus and the Horsa bridges. That precision landing there that has this benchmark of here's what you can do with gliders. And yet, conversely, in American set, I'm thinking about the Airborne Museum in Santa Maria Glees. It's just up the road from me. There's massive, great photos like you showed there of the gliders smashed into the hedgerows and the Horsa on its back in the field near San Marie du Mont and things like that. And it seems that where with the examination of the British, we focused on the precision, successful side of things. It seems that the focus has been on the less successful aspect of the American glider landings rather than that slide you've got up now, which is just how many infantry were brought in, how many vehicles were brought in. And would you agree with that assessment that over the years there's been a focus on the negative parts of it?
I think so, Paul. Actually, the word I often think about in everything that I read and learned as something of a historian and being very interested in all this for many, many years is how unrecognized it is, the lack of attention. How many books are there about paratroopers, and deservedly so, and different aspects of the airborne role in World War II. To me, it just seems like it's been on this side of the pond very much overlooked, and I don't really know why so much. But when I got into it and realized how such a small group of men, volunteers once again, contributed so much time and from one mission to the next, their recognition and this attention, I think, is largely overdue. I don't know why on your side of the pond the glider role has had a higher profile over the decades, but that certainly hasn't been the case here.
Well, I think we're going down a rabbit hole, but I think it's a little bit to do with the ambassadors in the sense that, with the British, we had some figures who were very involved in the telling of the story. So Major John Howard, who was brought in at Pegasus Bridge, was talking about them very, very glowingly. Jim Walwork, the pilot there, was around a lot. And, you mentioned James Gavin earlier on. And although James Gavin had this massive, great respect for the British glider pilot regiment, Mike Peters mentioned that yesterday. Gavin, when you read, he didn't like glider infantry. His love was paratroopers. And even with the paratroopers, he had his favorite regiment, the 505th, didn't particularly like the 507th and the 508th. And you take some of the battles, he seemed to be very dismissive of anything to do with gliders. He'd focus again on the artillery pieces that weren't there rather than the ones that were there. He seemed to have a way of writing about it where he always, as I said a minute ago, focused on the negative aspect. And I think Gavin is an incredibly influential figure. I admire him a lot for what he did, but he helped begin this idea that gliders were a flawed concept. They weren't very good, and I think because of that, a lot of history is built on that. That's one of the things I think about. The focus on the paratroopers.
Sure, and of course, he and others were the commanding officers were paratroopers, so they start from that perspective, and that's understandable. I think it had war planners understood from the outset of the realities of the battlefield and had better prepared glider pilots as infantrymen, if you will, from a training standpoint. I think that would have avoided or mollified a lot of the criticism and second guessing, perhaps, if you will, from General Gavin's perspective and so on. There were times that 5% of the men on the field from the airborne were glider pilots, and they were not well trained and were more of a pain, if you will, than a benefit once they were on the ground, once they had met their mission, which caused issues that Gavin made very clear. So I think from that standpoint, the glider pilots got short shrift by just not being as prepared in training for the realities of battle as they might have been, and as they were a little bit later on during the war. But I think you're right. That certainly laid the groundwork or planted the seeds for a lack of appreciation from a general consumer history.
And in your reading of the accounts written by the men who were there, the diaries, did you find any sense of they had been overlooked in Normandy? Was there any kind of resentment or jealousy of other units getting the press? I mean, or were they just proud of what they achieved, regardless of how they're perceived by other people?
I think their writing at the time was relieved, that they survived, proud that, by God, I got my glider down. And I think the third element that came up time and time again was grief at the buddies they lost. Yeah. Going back to base and seeing 5 or 6 empty bunks, and personal belongings being collected and that sort of thing, and wondering if they were going to be tapped for the next mission. I'm not sure they had a lot of time or inclination to think big picture in the heat of battle, if you will, from one mission to the next. And a good example is Dragoon. That was only a couple months later. And once again, faulty intelligence, poor planning, created a real chaos over the skies. The idea of gliders being towed for hours at a time, only 10 minutes apart, and thinking they could maintain that kind of separation proved to be folly. So this was a mission, while successful in many ways, was just horrific. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet over the battlefield, over the landing zones, when literally glider pilots were more worried in a way of flying into each other than necessarily just getting on the ground. It was tragic from that standpoint. And yet, at this time, 95% of the troops in the gliders were within reasonable range of their landing zones. So they were learning as they went. And Dragoon was a good example of that, even though there were still a lot of lessons to be learned before the next mission. You can see there that, once again, they rearmed and remanned the paratroopers in short order, relatively speaking, compared to Normandy and even some of the other missions that were to come. And they were beginning to come much more quickly now. Normandy to Dragoon, that was only a few months. Market Garden was even closer. But I want to take just a moment and pause again to look at these guys. Paul, one of the things that most surprised me is that they were, perhaps, to my knowledge, the only true combat orphans on the battlefield. Their senior officers were not with them. They were back at base. These guys were expected to land, fight the enemy, secure the zone if necessary, unload their gliders, report to an assembly area or a command post under a tree or in a trench somewhere, or a farmhouse, and then literally perhaps have to hitchhike their way back to the English Channel, get on a boat, and a week later finally get back to their base. What other unit on the battlefield has to endure that? I don't know of any others, but literally that was the case. And some of them were rapscallions. Some of these guys literally might take a few days off and visit a small French village or two on their way back to the beach. And it did give them, all of them, something of a checkered reputation. And I think that it did influence Gavin's reports and some of the others. But it was a small percentage of those guys who did that. Most of them were anxious to get back after guarding some prisoners or escorting prisoners, back to the Channel or back across the river. But they were a courageous, leaderless, homeless bunch, I think, unlike any other unit, if you will, in World War II.
That's a really good way of putting it, Scott. I'd never thought about that before, but it is they're without their commanding officers. That's a really good point. And if we've talked about it a lot on the channel, and when we talked about U.S. Marine Corps or British commandos, is there ever anything you can kind of single out as being a common factor among people who are successful with the type of unit? You know, in your reading of what makes a US glider pilot, was there some kind of single thing you could recognize among these guys? Obviously, they've got a sense of duty, they've got a sense of patriotism. But is there something else that you think would unite them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think an underlying current in so much of the material I read was really what got them into the glider program. And that is a love of flying. Some of these guys literally built planes while in high school, or gliders while in high school to be towed behind a car, you know, that kind of a thing. They all wanted to fly, whether they could qualify for bomber school or fighter school or whatever. And whatever it took to fly and serve their country and the very things that you're talking about, this was their only way to do it. And I did not sense any regrets necessarily that I wish I had joined the Navy instead, or anything along those lines. They weren't always happy with the way they were treated, the way they were handled, being homeless, leaderless, and all those kinds of things that were perhaps inevitable. But I was really struck by the fact that almost all of these young men had the bug of flying from the very, very beginning, usually long before the war started.
And we got a question, just because Mike took us through the rank system in the glider pilot regiment. Ranks, are they all officers? Are they lieutenants? How did it work with the American glider pilots?
Simplistically, they were all flight officers, first and second lieutenants. So those were the overwhelming majority of ranks during the course of the war, depending upon service and missions and all those kinds of things. Some of them, a number of them actually ultimately made the Army and the Air Force their careers for another 20 years. Some of them served into Korea and even Vietnam. But fundamentally, they were first and second lieutenants, flight officers. As I said earlier, in Market Garden, in fact, there was a provisional infantry unit of glider pilots established for a particular mission. And it was really the first all-officer, technically, infantry unit in the war. So,
and I want to just bring you back as well, because you used the phrase washout again, and I want to bring us back to some of the bad histories where glider pilots referred to as washouts. And because we talk a lot about language on this channel and how words can have this meaning way beyond what they actually mean. Because if you fail, I mean, you were involved with the Midway for so long there. Failing to be a US Navy fighter pilot doesn't mean you failed. It means you have not met the exacting, incredible standards required to fly a jet under carrier. But washout is a word that makes us feel failure. And I would like to kind of remind ourselves that in the 100 meters at the Olympics, the guys who win gold, silver, and bronze, the other people in the race are no way washouts. They're just not quite successful as those ones that came first, second, and third. So, as someone who's now studied the glider pilots, and and if you pick up a book now and it refers to, and all these people are washed out of fighter pilot training, that's it's a word that implies categoric failure, and it means they have not succeeded in one particular very, very strict field, but it doesn't mean that they are failures. It means that they've not met the very exacting standards. Does that word washout annoy you in that sense?
Well, thanks to your explanation as of today, it sure does. You're absolutely right. I shouldn't use it that way at all, because many, many times, again, reading their personal accounts, it wasn't a washout literally. It was they didn't have 20/20 eyesight.
Yeah, exactly.
They couldn't qualify. Many, many times it was that. Many times it wasn't even a matter of that. Relatively quickly in the war, there was a waiting list for bomber pilots and future fighter pilots. There was no room for them. Yes, some of them washed out after 6 weeks of training or whatever, but to use that as an umbrella term is really a mistake on my part.
No, it's not. I mean,
thank you for that. You're absolutely right.
Because we're kind of historians, and the people watching this understand that word has a very specific meaning in military terms. I'm talking about the average person who, if they go online and they read a little quick internet article about glider pilots, and someone says they were often washouts from fighter school, they might read into that something far worse than what is actually intended by it. And I think it's worth us taking the time now to just remind ourselves that these men were to go behind the controls of any type of glider, be it a hadron, as the British would call it, or a horse, or whatever it would be, nerves of steel. It's an incredible achievement to bring those things in. The hedgerows of Normandy, the stone walls of south of France, the stone walls of Sicily. So let's take a moment, folks, to remind ourselves what skill and bravery and dedication these guys had. But anyway, back to you, Scott.
No, thank you for that. Washout is now banished from my vocabulary, Paul, because you make a great point that's too simplistic a term.
In fact, one of our viewers, National World War II Glider Pilots, is saying it can just be just age. Simply, yes. they were taught this. So age is simply a factor against them as well, or even location. They're not near you're in the wrong part of the states where the training schools are somewhere else. There's many reasons why you would end up a glider pilot and not somewhere else. That no stigma involved. And I'm beating my drum too loudly now. Let's get on to Market Garden.
And I'm sure your fans and viewers know Market Garden well. It comes up many times in different contexts, so I won't go into a whole lot of detail. Obviously, the weather proved to be as much of an enemy almost in some ways, as the battle plan and the Germans. It's well known from a bridge too far perspective in many ways. What struck me about this is 1,900 gliders, the logistics and the planning, and that these guys would fly or be towed hundreds of miles, and across 40, 50 miles of enemy territory at 500 feet or 750 feet before they even got to their landing zones coming up from the south. It was just extraordinary to read their accounts. And this is where General Gavin really became critical of the glider pilots in some ways when he was writing after this mission. However, at one point, nearly 300 were commandeered, if you will, to guard the perimeter of one of the cities at one point, and they were in foxholes for a couple of days before the last of them were released and were told to hitchhike your way home, almost in a literal sense. So this was really probably, I would think, the first time that they had a real ground contribution, if you will, at least in Gavin's area. And I don't think that they got enough credit for that. Their accounts of what it was like sitting in those foxholes overnight, listening to the cries for medics and distinguishing the different incoming enemy fire, and making promises to their families and to God as to, how they would live their lives better if they ever got out or got back to base. Really inspired me and almost brought me to tears sometimes. And it's that kind of legacy that I want to honor and pay tribute to. It's a very famous crash photo you see there, Schofield. I won't go into all the details, but it struck me when I realized and learned reading his accounts later that it took 8 hours to get him out of that with horrible injuries, which he did survive. But it's just literally a snapshot of just what it was like, much less, before they contributed on the ground in that regard. Their numbers, again, there's no disputing just what they meant to what could have been, hopefully, the success of that mission, regardless. The other thing, Paul, I think about also is oftentimes I've read some accounts from paratroopers of how much they appreciated the glider pilots, the guys on the ground running out of ammunition and fuel and hanging on, and here come the gliders, either 3 hours later or the next morning. That came up time and time again. That I think is an unrecognized factor is, well, maybe the generals could second guess battle plans and so on. The men who were receiving the ammunition and the trailers and reinforcements had nothing but good things to say about the glider pilots braving enemy fire to deliver numbers like that.
Great point. Thank you.
The only humanitarian mission of the war for gliders. This was probably the mission, the second most resented mission, if you will, after the fact by those glider pilots that participated. On December 26th, a glider sneaked into the zone, Bastogne, to deliver a badly needed medical team. Those are the pilots on the right, part of the medical team that they delivered, followed by 10 gliders bringing in fuel to the 101st, just about the same time as the lead elements of Patton's tanks were reaching the southern end, the southern side of Bastogne. The next day, of course, the 27th, was a 50 glider mission. It was in large part a shooting gallery. Tragically, at the very last minute, the commanding officers learned that there had been a corridor opened from the south by Patton, and they felt it was too late to try to tell the navigators of the tow planes and change courses to the south. And so they flew the same courses the day before. And of course, by then, the enemy artillery and so on and small arms fire was locked on to these guys who were coming in flying fuel primarily. Those commanding officers also made the decision that the cargoes in these gliders were so explosive and so dangerous that only one trained glider pilot would be in each glider. There was no sense losing two trained glider pilots if they took a direct hit. So typically it was the senior officer, but not always, of any glider infantry that they were carrying would be given a 5-minute brief to be a co-pilot, strap into the co-pilot seat, and off you go. And there were accounts of glider pilots being wounded severely enough that it required severe wounds before they literally handed the controls over to an untrained pilot in the co-pilot seat to get on the ground. In this case, obviously, snow-covered fields.
Wow.
So reading their accounts personally, a lot of resentment here that they weren't allowed or authorized the change of routes to the south. But those were the decisions that were made at the last minute. The other, I think, chip on their shoulder, I suppose, Paul, is many glider pilots, whether they were involved or not, have referred to Patton getting all the credit as being unfair. That once again, the glider pilot's contribution, in addition to the paratroopers and the parapacks and the resupply and the tanks, somehow the glider pilots were again overlooked in the breakthrough to the 101st.
Patton wanting all the credit. Well, whatever next, Scott. I mean,
yeah.
you surprise me that with that statement there. I always thought he was a very unassuming,
yeah. Of course. Yeah. Good point. The final mission, the Fatherland Varsity. This one is, once again, these guys are test pilots, and it seems like from one mission to the next, changes in ground techniques or tactics rather, oftentimes adversely affected the gliders unintentionally. Montgomery's idea of smoke across the river to conceal the crossing of the Rhine, of course, made sense on one level. I'm not sure anyone thought it through that same smoke would then drift right over the landing and the drop zones, 6 miles away. I think one of the most extraordinary missions of the war for the gliders, being double towed for the first and only time. Again, no trained co-pilots. The other thing that strikes me is when you see these aerial views of landing zones, it's not a field, but rather it's a hodgepodge from Normandy to near Wessel here. And something, Paul, that really also struck me is how the glider pilots, when they were released at 500 feet with a descent rate of 950 feet a minute, so they had very little time. Or if they were released at 3,000 feet, they had minutes to get through enemy fire, to then find a field and line up while circling it to land and to make sure that they weren't racing another glider for the same spot. Or literally on some of these small fields, they would write about, well, there were 3 gliders on one side of the farm field. I was going to aim for the right side. Or here's a farm field with hedgerows that didn't seem quite so thick. I'm coming in hot. I'll go through them and actually intend to land on the next field over. But I'll go through the hedges or the farm fences to slow down because the fields are so small, rather. That kind of thinking while undergoing enemy fire, while your glider infantry are being wounded or perhaps killed in back, as you drop like a rock in some ways, just amazes me to this day that's what it took to meet their mission, and they certainly did time and time again. That I think is really remarkable. You know, you asked about surprises earlier. I've written several books and I've been to battlefields in Europe. And I think something that historians probably know this, but a lot of civilians don't, is the intimacy of war. That these are not huge battlefields. It's not just about artillery lobbing shells 2 miles away. Not to take anything away from the horror of that. But this is a good example of a glider coming in hard. You can see the flak damage and probably small arms fire, perhaps. Hitting, it doesn't look like it's been unloaded yet. And if you look closely, obviously you can see a couple helmets. I'm not sure if these are glider pilots or paratroopers, but the point being, this would be a typical scenario for a glider pilot getting down somehow with battle damage, taking cover, helping secure the area, and then getting back to business of unloading this glider and eventually getting back to base. This was the first mission where the landing zones had not been secured by paratroopers in advance. They came in literally alongside them, where drop zones and landing zones were almost on top of each other or certainly overlapping. So this was a whole different concept, if you will, the last major mission of the war. And this is where there was a provisional infantry unit of glider pilots assigned to guard a crossroads at an expected avenue of retreat by Germans. And sure enough, it took place at midnight. They were very successful in turning back the retreat, killing a number, more than 100 were taken prisoner. Literally, they all received battle awards for valor after the war. Everyone in that unit, I believe it was Bronze Stars, as I recall. So they earned their medal on the ground in what became the last mission of the war. Something that strikes me here as a little microcosm, I suppose, of what these glider pilots endured is, you know, these were massive glider missions, you know, hundreds, if not thousands. Imagine the tail end Charlies, the guys in the last 2 or 3 squadrons, you know, where gliders have been flying the exact same route for hours over enemy artillery emplacements, or maybe for days if it's a, you know, market garden or whatever. There wasn't much, I don't think, room for belief that the final squadrons would get through unscathed. In fact, the last squadron here, the last 12 glider pilots, 3 were killed, 8 were taken prisoner, and only 1 returned to base right away, actually the next day. Again, a microcosm of the certainty of enemy fire and the lack of surprise that these pilots endured on every mission, particularly those, you know, toward the tail end, if you will. And yet they persevered time and time again. And you can see there, the numbers, I think, are extraordinary for such a small group of men, if you will, of heroes. I think it's to their credit. And a lot of people don't realize that following varsity a few months later, obviously after the surrender, some of them were beginning to train for the invasion of Japan. New training techniques were being developed for gliders. How do you land a glider weighing 3-4 tons in a rice paddy? A whole different concept. And those techniques were underway at the time. And fortunately, of course, that didn't take place. And everyone was able to come home. But it really is, I think, a remarkable part of the legacy of those who served in World War II in Europe. You know, there were 3 million Americans on the continent at the end of the war. About 70,000 paratroopers. The numbers vary quite a bit. Only about 4, maybe 5,000. The numbers vary. Glider pilots, and yet they played an important role. I think airborne role, combat role, indirectly across the entire continent. You know, leading ultimately to victory. I look at these faces. I wonder about their mothers and wives and sisters waiting for them to come home. How much they did not share for decades until later in their life. But they certainly deserve our thanks today, and certainly recognition and a legacy I think we need to preserve for future generations. And in that vein, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share their legacy with your viewers and your fans today.
Well, thank you, Scott. And we'll do some questions now. And I'm thinking that expression again we've used on this channel quite a lot is that they probably punched above their weight. I mean, that's for 4,000 or so glider pilots. When we add up the tonnage of supplies brought in and the amount of glider infantry brought in, it's outstanding. It's we've talked about a lot of units on this channel that have performed well, and I'll talk about all the time. And I say we're left with the fact that a lot of general histories are somewhat dismissive of the glider pilots, particularly the American glider pilots. And you've done a good job in redressing that balance. So we'll see what questions we've got, and then we'll do that. So Great Dominion is saying, were glider pilots of the 2nd Air Commando supporting Chindit's Operation Thursday in 1944 drawn from the same pool as those involved in European airborne operations?
They were, from the standpoint that they were all trained in the same way, obviously. There wasn't specific training per se for the Pacific versus the Atlantic. Different squadrons and troop carriers obviously were assigned to different theaters from that perspective. So they were drawn from the same training pool, if you will, the training schools, the bases. But obviously they were just like Pacific soldiers and the European theater. Different units were assigned accordingly.
Okay, and reminding you folks that Robert Lyman is on next week on Wednesday, I think, where I'll be talking about some of the operations in Burma, and he'll be talking about Operation Thursday there. So Leslie is asking, did the glider pilots receive any special medal?
Yes, and thank you for asking that question. Again, going back to one of your first questions, Paul, about surprises, they earned an air medal every single time they took off on each of these missions. That's the equivalent of a Bronze Star.
Right.
When I did not know that as a civilian historian. I did not realize that until I did the research. Other aviators, it took 10 or 5 missions, bombers or fighter pilots, to earn an air medal, a Bronze Star. These guys received an air medal every single mission, which gives you a sense of what they endured, what they accomplished, and what their senior officers recognized was extremely dangerous duty.
And in your process researching this, what were your big surprises? I mean, did you go in with any of these preconceived ideas that they weren't as good as some of the other branches, and then were surprised, or did you go into it already having faith that was kind of wrong, that representation?
Honestly, neither one.
Right.
When I went into this
objectively.
Yeah, when I went into this, Paul, I had written down the word glider while researching an earlier book. I went into this thinking, who are these guys? I didn't know any more than that, because I'm not a lifelong academic historian, as probably many of your audience is, and so on. So this was something that it was a journey of discovery. And the more I got into it, it didn't take very long before I realized, yes, this is a book I want to write. Yes, it's going to take a couple of years, but by God, I want to know more. And I think America would want to know more about these extraordinary heroes. So I think that probably benefited me to a large extent, that I didn't need to overcome or dispute or rebut preconceived ideas that preceded me by Gavin and other people, but rather, who are these men? Who are these heroes? I want to get to know them.
I mean, that's what I appreciated about your book is you didn't aggressively have a go at a generation of historians. You just let their deeds speak for themselves, which is ultimately the best way of doing it. Is that just presenting, here's what they did, and then allowing the reader to make their own mind up about that. But one of the things, another question from Big War Games, and this is connecting with what Mike Peters was talking about yesterday, because again, in the British system, the glider pilot regiment is army. A lot of the people in the tug aircraft are Air Force, they're officers, the glider pilot are sergeants. What were the kind of experiences, connections, respect between the tow pilots and the glider pilots? Because they're going to have a similar rank. They're going to be lieutenants and captains. They've got the same kind of wings on. Was there mutual respect? Was there misunderstanding what the roles are? What was your kind of what's your gut feeling about that connection?
Well, it might surprise some folks to hear me say this. Fundamentally, they were strangers. Right. They were all assigned to a troop carrier group. From that standpoint, they trained together for obvious reasons and that sort of thing, and were assigned missions and that. But they were largely independent of one another. I remember reading accounts where On several occasions, the glider pilot might walk up, or the navigator might walk up, or the tow pilot might walk up and introduce each other literally on the tarmac at 30 minutes before they're taking off. They may know each other from previous training missions and that sort of thing, training sometimes for months before a major mission later in the war. But it's always been my understanding that they were largely independent groups, each with their own roles, and training demands. Certainly they had to work together from a training standpoint. A lot of times glider pilots wrote that they walked up and introduced themselves to the glider infantry getting ready to load in. So it was really a band of strangers in some respects when you look at it from that perspective.
Okay. National glider pilot, World War II glider pilots is saying that sometimes glider pilots flew as co-pilots in C-47. So that's something I didn't know. And thanks everybody for contributing, as you always do. Extra information, great questions there. One more, and this might be something even other people watching can join in here. And Bruce Day is asking, was there any effort ever made at air traffic control, any air to ground comms at all? When you talk about being in the last squadrons, bringing in gliders to hot landing zones like Varsity, having more communication is always a subject on this channel.
Sure.
The lack of it or how it doesn't work. But I don't think there was ever. Have you ever read anything about trying to improve that kind of aspect?
There was some talk of that, and I must have confessed, Bruce, I didn't get into it real deeply, but I believe it was Varsity where they attempted some ground communication teams to help provide that kind of role. I don't believe it was particularly successful. It was, I think, the first attempt, but I didn't get into a lot of details. But it does bring up an interesting side point that many times these glider pilots had no communications the entire mission from the time they took off. There was a single radio cable wrapped around the tow rope, from the glider back to the tow, up to the tow plane. Shrapnel could shred it or separate it in a heartbeat. So there are many, many after action reports where they would talk about and complain about communications between the tow plane and the glider breaking down, relying on light or hand signals from the tow plane. I can't imagine what that must have been like sitting in the glider cockpits, but that was the case. But in terms of air traffic control, 6 miles into Germany or into France, not much at all. No.
Yeah, no, and hence your brilliant phrase of combat orphans. That they are often isolated and separated, and I'd not really thought about that before. So to wind things up, I'll hold the copy of the book up there. What are your hopes for the book? There's obviously you want people who are relatives of the people who glider pilots to read it, but for the kind of the World War II TV audience, those people that read lots of World War II histories, what would you hope their takeaways would be?
Well, I hope they come to appreciate perhaps a slice of the greatest generation that they don't know much about or haven't read much about, whether they've heard about the British glider pilots or not, or Gavin or not, or Ambrose or not, or all those kinds of things. I hope there's enough of an open mind, if you will, or interest level to simply explore the role of the glider pilot, and more importantly, the makeup of the men who volunteered to fly these one-way missions with no motors and no parachutes and no second chances. And I think if they do, they'll come away impressed and grateful for the role they did play in Europe.
Exactly, and it's that whole thing where you can quite legitimately examine the strategy behind the use of gliders and be critical of how they were deployed or flight paths or operation, and you can also have huge respect for those that were actually doing it. I mean, that's going to come up next week with Robert Lyman Chindits in Burma. The Chindit concept can be brought into question, but you cannot question the bravery of a guy who's happy to slog through hundreds of miles of Burmese jungle to try and win the war. And you can have those two thoughts in your head at the same time. So you can read the book and be critical of perhaps of how they put together Operation Husky, but still come away with untold respect for the men who actually brought those, as you said yourself, tubular steel and canvas with 70,000 parts into a battlefield at the speeds they're bringing in. So, well, it's been brilliant talking to you, Scott, and I think I have to invite you back to come and talk one of your previous books, because there's more mileage there. This is just the one that you're talking about right now. But have you enjoyed talking to our bunch of viewers today?
Thank you. It's been a delight. Great questions. I've learned to never use the word washout again, at least in the
Well, I
context.
haven't scarred
No,
you for life with that, but no, it's been a
no,
fantastic conversation, Scott. And folks,
thank you.
we've got one more show this week. Greg Way is going to come on and talk about the German glider concept tomorrow, and that'll end off this week. And you've probably noticed, folks, I've been listing furiously all the shows for our Torch to Tunis series that starts after. Well, next week we're talking about the Pacific. We've got 4 or 5 shows there. And then we've got 3 weeks of program about Torch to Tunis. I've been rapidly putting them up on screen now. If you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to consider becoming a patron or YouTube channel member. And don't forget to buy the books of my guests, because that's how they earn a healthy crust. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, viewers. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.